it was kind of expected to be sort of like an S year minus the naming that Apple has kind of moved away from. So just to summarize, some of the changes include the 120Hz ProMotion on the Pro models, some pretty big upgrades in terms of the main camera, the amount of light it lets in, some very noticeable upgrades in the ultra-wide camera, and also some small differences in the zoom camera. But the battery life is also another area that I noticed was significantly better this year. So when it comes to the design itself, from the outside and from a distance, it is pretty much the same as the iPhone 12 lineup. It has the flat edges still, which were introduced last year, and I feel like that was actually a really good change that people liked a lot more because it just made the phone easier to grip, and it also allowed the front screen to be a lot more durable. But just the general functionality of it, I really like that Apple has gone with a flat design, because there's been so many years where phones were going towards like the curved edge, which they thought was very elegant, and even having like edge features. But to be honest, having the screen real estate in like a flat finish is definitely the way to go in my opinion. And aside from it being a little bit thicker thanks to the battery and also larger camera elements, the iPhone 13 lineup looks pretty much the same. Unfortunately, if you are coming from the iPhone 12, which I imagine very few people are, you won't be able to use the previous cases just because it is a little bit thicker. But I do feel like the trade-offs that contribute to the small adjustments in its form factor are definitely worth it. One thing that you will also notice though is the weight. And I believe the iPhone 13 Pro is about 20 grams heavier than the 12 Pro, and the 13 Pro Max is under 20 grams heavier than the 12 Pro Max, and it is something that you definitely notice. And that is one of the reasons why I might actually be switching to the smaller iPhone 13 Pro instead of the 13 Pro Max this year. The other most notable change though is in the notch, and it's about 20% smaller, which isn't like crazy, and with no additional like functionality or interface changes such as battery percentage, it doesn't really add much function. But having that smaller notch as we move into the future is always nice, because it allows you to have more screen real estate to obviously watch like YouTube videos and stuff. And also when you're scrolling down from the top, it just gives you a bit more space to access Control Center and also the notification stack that has been redesigned in iOS and is a very welcome change. So yeah, that is like another thing that you might notice a little bit, but otherwise all the ports and everything are still the same. You have the Lightning port on the bottom, which I know some people mentioned USB Type-C would be nice, and with like the EU regulations that are being talked about right now, we might see USB Type-C in the future. But I feel like for a generation that didn't have any like crazy design like differences, it actually would have been nice if this was a year that they switched over to USB Type-C, as the rest of the whole iPad lineup starts to move towards that as well, such as what you saw on the iPad mini. The next big update to talk about though is the display. And the iPhone has always had like a very color accurate screen that was generally bright enough, but this year they've introduced ProMotion for the very first time to the iPhone lineup. We've seen this on the iPads in the past and it was great, whether you're scrolling through the interface and everything, but it wasn't like the previous iPhones really needed it, because iOS is already a very clean animation interface that just makes everything look very clean, smooth, and fast. But this year, the Super Retina XDR ProMotion display uses the LTPO panel, and what's unique about that is that it is actually able to give you like a variable refresh rate and a wider range of brightness between 10 Hz to 120 Hz, and the phone also has a max brightness of 1000 nits and up to 1200 in HDR. The reason why that is important is because a lot of times with fast refresh rates on like Android phones, you have the option to go between like 60 and 120 Hz or like an auto switching between them, but being able to go down to 10 Hz, even though there isn't like an ambient mode, allows this phone to really save that battery, because 120 Hz at all times is just going to drain it a lot faster, and a lot of times you may not even notice it if the app doesn't actually support it. Throughout like the overall interface, everything is like just buttery smooth, and you do sort of notice the 120 Hz if you are like a power user, and just like navigating the menus, the settings and everything, that is very nice. But I think where it's going to see its best use is when developers start to optimize their applications to be able to take advantage of that, because otherwise it defaults to 60 Hz. The other aspect, of course, though, is in the processor, and each year Apple updates a processor. That is kind of a given, and we have the new A15 Bionic chip across the whole lineup of iPhone 13s. Essentially, this is a 6-core CPU and a 5-core GPU on the Pro models, while being a 4-core on the non-Pro models, and it should give you about a 50% improvement in terms of GPU performance. And honestly, even though they didn't really talk much about like the CPU, the previous generation iPhones were already plenty powerful. I never had any issues on like processing and and like doing like a little bit of video editing, having all my apps open. And honestly, the only time I noticed that the iPhone may have struggled a little bit is if I was editing a ton of photos in Adobe Lightroom, for example, where I would see the screen dim just a little bit to prevent the phone from like overheating. And that did make it a little bit difficult to edit photos on your mobile phone because you just can't see what it's supposed to be. So I think the GPU improvements for people who do like a lot of graphic intensive tasks or edit a ton of photos on the mobile device, you're definitely going to see a tangible improvement there. And especially for those who are doing some like iMovie or video editing as well as the processing in the photos and the ability to shoot in ProRes on the Pro models, that is where the GPU is going to be applied. Say that generally speaking, I find that iOS 15, even though it is like a bit of an incremental update, they fixed some of the things that I've definitely complained about in the past, including the notification stack. I like the fact that everything is located nicely organized, and it just makes it a lot easier because in some days, I might get 40 to 50 phone calls as well as 60 emails, and everything just starts to get really, really messy, and I'm someone who definitely has to get to every single one. I do like the features like focus mode and SharePlay, though I'm not sure how often I'll actually use that, but I do also like the improvements made to the Notes app, which is something that I use literally every single day, and I think at this point there are over 1,000 notes in there. And I do think some of the improvements made to Safari are also very welcome with the overall like interface and stuff, but also having the search bar on the bottom, because if you have like a larger version like the Pro Max model, then it can sometimes be a little bit hard to reach the top. Before we move on though, I want to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of this video, Extra, which is the first debit card that actually lets you build credit and also earn rewards, which is really important, especially when you're young. It allows users to connect Extra to their bank account, and by making everyday purchases, Extra spots you and then auto pays the next business day. At the end of each month, payments are tallied up and reported to credit bureaus, allowing you to build credit on your everyday purchases. Most importantly though, there is no credit checks and no import fees. As someone who got their first credit card and was a little bit scared to use it and stuck to using a debit card, I later realized just how important it is to build your own credit, especially when making adult purchases eventually, such as real estate and leasing cars, and just having that good credit allows you to have a basis. I've realized in so many scenarios just how important having a good credit score is in the real world. So sign up for Extra in my link in bio and start building your credit with a debit card. Yes, that is a debit card. And a huge thanks to them once again for sponsoring this video. Before we move on to the camera though, which perhaps could be the most important feature upgrades for this year, the battery life I feel like is the one that most general consumers are going to notice the most. This right here has an improvement of an hour and a half on the iPhone 13 and a 2.5 improvement on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And compared to previous generations, the battery size is significantly improved. The display with the LTPO as well as iOS 15 all come together to give you those improvements. And based on real world tests, they definitely live up and in some areas even exceed them. As I've always said, the iPhone 12 Pro is literally the best phone that I've used to date. There's very few complaints of it, and in previous years, I may have been very happy with like the iPhone 11, but the battery life just wasn't good enough. For someone who uses their phone for work and is on it like 9 to 10 hours a day with such a large device, I used to not be able to get through an entire day when I felt like I should have been able to, and the iPhone 12 Pro was the first one that I was able to do that with. But by adding 2.5 hours of an improvement on this year's flagship is really significant, and even I don't think I could drain this entire battery in a full day, even if I was recording like a ton of 4K videos and I was out and about and I was using 5G cellular for the entire day. It is truly impressive, and it's almost to the point where I might actually switch to the iPhone 13 Pro, because in previous years, the smaller Pro model of iPhone just wasn't as good in terms of battery life and was even beat out by like the non-Pro model that was the same size. And I definitely prioritize battery life, so I kind of had to pick between that, but I feel like the iPhone 13 Pro is like a very comfortable size that I personally would love to use, and being like a very zero compromise decision to make this year with the camera elements and everything being the same and a very good battery life that even beats out in some areas the iPhone 12 Pro Max from last year. I think it is like a very key deciding factor, and especially if you're coming from an earlier generation iPhone, which I imagine most purchasers will be, then you're going to find the battery life to be just absolutely insane in terms of improvement from before. So yeah, battery life in all areas is impressive. So perhaps the biggest talk this year has been about the cameras. And last year's iPhone camera was already one of the best in the market overall. It was the best in video for the most part, and in photos with all the computational stuff paired with the sensor and the stabilization, it really did make the Pro Max model's camera the best all around. But there were definitely some improvements that have to be made. The wide angle camera was one that was already pretty solid, but this year we saw an improvement to an f1.5 aperture and a larger 1.9 micron sensor, making it the biggest one yet, allowing 2.2x more light. And this is really going to contribute to not only like some daylight photos, but especially in scenarios with mid to low light. Honestly, when it comes to doing like the daylight photos in like pretty good scenarios, I couldn't really tell a big difference. And I imagine most general consumers, if they're comparing it to last year's iPhone, aren't really going to be able to tell as well. But when compared to like the 10 or the 11, it is going to be a major improvement. And especially when it comes to low light, compared to the iPhone 12 Pro and Pro Max, I found that the night mode was really able to shine through, and it wasn't just because there's more details and shadows, but with Apple's like computational advancements, it seemed like they do a very good job of segmenting different scenes, which is something that they talked a lot about, whether it was faces, shadows, highlights, setting the white balance, the exposure and everything. And especially in low light images, I found that they let the things that are dark stay dark while not trying to like over sharpen or overcompensate the shadows like you see on a lot of Android phones, where even though it looks like it's seeing in the dark, it almost seems like too cartoonish and over sharpened at the same time. It still maintains like a good level of being like natural, but at the same time giving you details in areas where a camera that doesn't have the amount of light coming in and the segmentation would not otherwise be able to distinguish. One camera that I do use a ton though is the ultra wide. You guys know I love real estate. I love posting updates of like the renovation projects and making you guys a big part of it. And also just like showing the space that I've seen and like taking pictures of architecture. And even though last year's like ultra wide camera saw a bit of an improvement, letting in a little bit more light, this year's is a significant improvement. It is now a 6-element lens with an aperture of f1.8, letting in 93% more light, and that is going to contribute very nicely to like any ultra-wide photos, even if it's in good lighting. I always found that the ultra-wide was just a little bit soft on the edges, and especially when it comes to like editing or areas of shadows, it definitely fell apart a lot easier than on the main camera. And this year, the ultra-wide camera is probably the biggest change of all, because it also contributes to the macro mode, which is one that if you like taking photos of like small details, you can get right up to it 2 centimeters away, and it'll be able to get you a really nice texture image. I also really like to shoot video on the ultra-wide camera, and in previous years, it just didn't have like enough light and was a noticeable downgrade from the main camera. But this year, obviously lower aperture is great. The telephoto camera, on the other hand, I feel like is a bit of a downgrade in my opinion. It's a 3x instead of a 2.5x, and the aperture is an f2.8 compared to the f2.2 on last year's 2.5x camera. And to be honest, 3x is like a little bit more of a zoom, but that amount of aperture difference can contribute pretty heavily, especially in zoomed in photos where you definitely do need a little bit more light. Apple hasn't really gone in the direction of adding like the hybrid zoom, the periscope, or the 100x and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that would make the camera bump and the area a little bit more inconsistent, but I hope in like future models, they do focus on the zoom camera a little bit more. But out of all the cameras, I use the main one the most, obviously, and I use the ultra wide a ton. And I've just never been someone who uses the 2x, the 2.5x, or the 3x camera that much. The photography style mode is also something that has been talked about a lot, and this essentially allows you to set like a picture profile that is baked into your photo permanently before you go ahead and take it. So if you go into the settings of the iPhone camera, you can scroll between the different options, and I believe there is 5 of them, including the standard, rich contrast, warm, cool, and also vivid. And I would say based on the characteristics, rich contrast looks a lot like what you find on the Google Pixel, which for many years was literally the best camera on the market. The vivid one looks a lot like Samsung, and the warm and cool just depends on your color tone. And you guys might have seen, like, I mean, everybody's style sort of changed over the years, and I used to have photos that were very cool, and now they might have warmed up a little bit ever since I switched over to a Leica, and the feed has kind of gone that direction as well. So Yeah, it really does come down to your style, but it is not a preset. And Apple has tried to make that very, very clear that it isn't just like a stupid filter that's thrown on there like you would do on VSCO or Lightroom. It is essentially a picture profile characteristic that still goes through its whole like computational photography and strategically is able to sense different areas through the segmentation and apply these characteristics accordingly. In my opinion, if you're just going to be editing the photos in Lightroom and VSCO and you know what you're doing, then standard is probably going to be the best option because it gives you the most realistic look, the most dynamic range, and it doesn't like crush the shadows a little bit, add any contrast or vibrance because you're probably going to do that in post anyways. But if you go ahead and have like the vivid or the rich contrast, which I know a ton of people who just don't want to edit their photos afterwards or may not know how to, then that can give you that characteristic right off the bat. Onto video quality though, the iPhone for many years has been probably the best video camera overall because it did a really good job of the colors. It was very consistent, the white balance was good, focusing was pretty decent, and the stabilization is probably one of the best and most natural looking ones that I've seen on the market. I've tested out a lot of good phones that have great photo cameras and even budget ones that had great photo cameras as well, but one area that always lacked was the video. It just looked like a lot worse than the photo quality. And even though Samsung has gotten very close over the years, the iPhone, I believe, extends its lead once again with the video quality. The main camera, being an f1.5 aperture, is able to capture great video at lower light situations than before. And with sensor shift stabilization now on the smaller models and also in the non-pro models, that is also great because even though the difference was a little bit minor in like general situations as we tested last year, it is nice that there are no compromises across the entire lineup when it comes to the stabilization of the main camera. The cinematic mode is a new feature that Apple had talked a lot about during their event, and what that is essentially able to do is utilize the portrait characteristics and all the algorithms and sensors and that kind of stuff after they introduced portrait mode a few years ago to give it to you in the video setting. And it is able to like smart detect people who are walking in a frame, do a natural rack focus, and give you like the bokeh that you would expect out of a professional camera at the palm of your hand. And even though this is like a cool feature to play with, honestly, it's one that I don't think I'll use very often. And even though it works pretty well, it just doesn't look the same as what you would expect out of a large camera. And it might just be because I'm used to using a real camera every single day, but I don't know. I feel like in a few years it'll get better and it's already pretty decent, but it's just not something that I believe is like what I would use on an everyday basis. I feel like the main video camera in the standard mode is just too good in its 4K to want to use anything else. ProRes video is also going to be a feature on the Pro models, and that is pretty much what it is. It allows you to record in a 4K ProRes video format, which is what we actually edit in, but the only thing is you're still shooting on a smartphone, and unless you really have to shoot a movie on your device, it records 6 gigabytes per minute, and that is a ton. And it's why the base model of the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max will only allow you to record ProRes in 1080p as opposed to 4K. Is it a mode that I'm going to use? I mean, if I forget my camera for some weird reason, then I'll probably turn it on and just like use it as a last resort option, but 6 gigabytes a minute from what I've heard, that is a ton, even for someone who has like a 1 terabyte iPhone. Think about recording like a 5 to 10 minute clip and your memory is just gonna be gone right away. So unless you're importing that right away and deleting it off your device, then I feel like it's one that very few users are really going to take advantage of. And even in like a professional field, I'm gonna be curious to see how many people actually use it. So yeah, when it comes to cameras, as someone who kind of uses all the features within the iPhone lineup, I feel like they've generally done a pretty good job. The things that I care about most have been upgraded. The ultra-wide camera is a pretty big difference. The main camera in general situations is not like most noticeable coming from last year's phone, but is always welcome to have more light, and also the improvements in the low light images. But cinematic mode is not one that I plan to use very often. I don't really find myself using portrait mode that often either, but it is very good. And the front-facing camera is one that I personally don't use that much. It's still decent, it records in 4K, you can even record ProRes on the front-facing camera, but yeah, you're not gonna see me taking very many selfies. So at the end of the day, what do I think about the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro? Should you get the Pro model? Should you upgrade from last year's iPhone? And the answer to last year's iPhone is no. You really don't need to upgrade because last year's iPhone was already very good and it fixed a ton of the flaws that we may have noticed in previous generations. But if you're coming from a previous generation iPhone like the iPhone 10 or even before that, then these differences are going to be huge. You're gonna love the new design, the display, everything's just gonna feel a little bit snappier, the battery life is impressive, and the camera quality is just gonna be so much better. I feel like in the last 3 years, Apple has done a really good job on the computational side, but has also like slowly upgraded the hardware where they feel like it needed to be improved accordingly without doing anything extreme, and definitely not playing the numbers game that a lot of other companies are doing with like high megapixels, pixel binning, and all that kind of stuff. Although I do feel like sometimes they are a little bit slow to implement things and that the zoom camera is still like not quite there. Otherwise, like the main camera and the ultra-wide camera has seen some pretty good improvements. The battery life improvements are pretty significant to the point where I'm actually going to be switching over to the iPhone 13 Pro and going with a smaller model for the first time in many years. And that is just because they've improved the battery life to the point where I'm going to be able to get through an entire day on the smaller model, but the fact that the camera has zero compromises. The 120 Hz refresh rate is nice, but it's definitely not one to go ahead and buy a brand new phone for. And I would say this year, if you are looking between like the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro, it is a situation where I think the Pro model is worth it because they've made many more upgrades to that compared to the non-Pro. It does use the sensor from the iPhone 12 Pro Max last year, and it does have the sensor stabilization and also some improvements here and there. But generally speaking, most of the improvements have been applied to the Pro models, and I feel like for the extra money, it can be worth it. I also think with a high refresh rate and the ability to go from 10 to 120 Hertz and the brightness and all that kind of stuff, there should be like an ambient mode where you can have like an alarm clock or just something that we see on the Apple Watch, because it does have the capability to do that from the hardware standpoint. The zoom camera is also one that could use some improvement, and one of the best like technical innovations I've seen in smartphones in the past few years has been the periscope. We tested it out on Huawei and Oppo, and I was really impressed by just how nice of photos I was able to get in like Paris, for example, with like a 5x optical zoom. And I think with how good the main camera is, there isn't really a need for the 3x, but instead maybe like a 5x that can also have a hybrid of 10x, where there is actually some tangible practicality to that. I hope fast charge continues to improve in the future, especially on the MagSafe side, and I know like the cooling technologies are also being worked on, but at the same time I also hope to see like an in-display fingerprint sensor built in, or even one built into like a button in the future. Even though Face ID is really nice, I think the next step is to completely streamline the notch to just have like a whole